Welcome back, everyone. We have another lecture here on American government, and I thought I'd do something a little different for this one. I don't want to overstep my power here. I think some of you are maybe a little resentful for me for being too much of a hard and having too much power. So I'm going to go ahead and step back a bit and I'll let you guys take over on this lecture. Guys, you're not giving the lecture. You're not presenting any slides. You're not doing the work. I'm going to do this differently. I'm not going to make y'all do it. I'm going to create a situation where I can't make y'all do it. From now on, it's all up to y'all. Okay, this lecture's not really going anywhere, though, is it? I'm sitting here waiting. Nothing's happening. Okay, take two. All right, guys, this is Professor Tatum. I am here to lead you now through yet another lecture for History 1301. We are looking here at the U.S. Constitution. All right, looking at a little shift toward order while still maintaining a good deal of liberty. We'll look at a little bit of context as usual, and then we'll look at what I consider to be a bloodless coup, which is the process in which the United States Constitution was created. We'll also come to understand that the Constitution was based on a series of conflicts and compromises. And by that sense, it is by no means a perfect document. We'll also examine the process of ratification, meaning approving the Constitution and actually putting it into effect. And we'll also examine the Bill of Rights, which are your fundamental rights as an American. So remember, the Articles of Confederation had created a pretty weak central government intentionally. A lot of the drafters of these articles were very skeptical and fearful of having too much power in the hands of government or in a centralized military, largely due to their history, both through the English Civil War and through the American Revolution. So they created this very weak central government with a one-house Congress, no executive branch, no judicial branch. But this government really wasn't able to get anything done. Kind of like I was sitting there at the beginning of the lecture saying, all right, guys, get the lecture together. Get the lecture together. Well, maybe I have some ideas for getting the lecture rolling, but I can't do anything about it because I'm putting y'all in charge. Well, that's kind of how the articles worked, all right? The central government couldn't really do anything to help the bigger picture. For example, remember, they couldn't regulate the economy, so there was massive debt and hyperinflation as the states were all creating their own forms of currency. They were overprinting money. And furthermore, really, for the federal government to be able to do anything, they had to depend on the states, right? They had to get 9 to 13 votes to get any laws passed nationally, and they had to get all 13 states on board to be able to amend the articles. They were also unable to deal with foreign affairs or domestic concerns. Again, they don't have the authority to do these types of things. And another major problem is there's nothing in the article stating that they can have an army, a centralized army, that is, and they can't really raise the funds necessary to pay for an army. And this was all highlighted by Shays' Rebellion. Remember, this was that rebellion where veterans and farmers, largely in response to the failings of the Articles of Confederation, which had created this system of hyperinflation, where people were being thrown into debtors' prisons and their farms were being foreclosed on, and they were unsure if they were ever going to be paid for their service in the American Revolution, inspired all these people to start revolting. And since there was such limited federal authority and no army, the federal government couldn't really do anything about this rebellion. They just had to kind of watch it play out and hope that the states could take care of it. Remember, the state of Massachusetts did manage to put together a militia to suppress this rebellion, but that definitely could have gone differently. As I suggested in the last lecture, history is nowhere near inevitable. This could have gone so many different ways. This could have spread across state lines. This could have led to the ends of the Confederation, and the project of U.S. government could have very easily failed here. This demonstrated the weakness of the articles, as I suggested. It also led to the conclusion that there needed to be some major changes made to the articles to prevent things like this from happening and getting out of hand. And not long after Shays' Rebellion, 12 of the 13 states sent delegates to meet and discuss how they would amend these articles at the Philadelphia Convention. Now, Rhode Island was a little skeptical about what these delegates were actually up to. They were afraid that they might create a new system of government, and that they might create one that was a little too powerful, or that they may even stick within the articles and end up amending the articles to an extent that the government that they had created was not what they were going to be seeing from here on out. So they said, you know what, we're not going to participate in this. They're up to something shady. We don't want to be a part of it. And they weren't entirely wrong, okay? We can consider the demographics of the men here at the Philadelphia Convention. They're all white, clearly. They're all men. They're all property-owning men, and they're primarily college-educated. right? Elite, white, college educated, property owning men. That is a very small portion of their overall society, all right? This is not a fair representation of all the people throughout these new United States. And on their own, without holding any elections or anything like that, these delegates who came here on behalf of these 12 states made the decision on their own to scrap the Articles of Confederation. They said, this framework for our government is no good. Let's just throw it out and start afresh. And they decided to write a whole new constitution. And they kind of knew what they were doing was a bit questionable. And that's demonstrated by the fact that they went ahead and locked all the doors and they made a vow of secrecy. They made everybody swear that anything discussed in this room had to stay within this room. And I mean, they took that so seriously that they had to put tails on old Ben Franklin. Because old Ben Franklin liked to go hanging out with ladies, going and having drinks and things. And he was old as a dinosaur at this point in time. And they were afraid that he might go out blabbering to some pretty lady or to someone else at a bar about what was going on here behind closed doors. So they had to have spies basically go escort him home to make sure he wasn't blabbering. All right. And they all realized we really need to be making sure that the people are okay with what we're doing here so they don't try to kill us all. So they said we need to get the people's approval of whatever constitution we create here. All right. Some of them probably did say, hey, that's actually a fundamental part of what we stand for. I'm not okay with doing this behind closed doors unless we get approval from the people. All right. I'm sure there were some people who stood up and said that. But they all agreed that they would only get the people's support after the fact. So they kind of asked for forgiveness instead of asking for permission, type of mindset. So I want you guys to consider, how democratic was this decision to create this new constitution? How democratic was this process? I know people like to argue that the United States is a democratic nation and we're founded on the idea of democracy. Well, guys, this here is the founding of the modern United States. Okay, this is the creation of the framework of the United States that we currently live under. This is the foundation of the republic here. How democratic is this process? If we have white property-owning elites, mostly educated, locking the doors and agreeing only to get the people's approval after they decide what they're going to do here. They're throwing out the government without anyone's approval. Guys, that is a coup. That is an overthrow of government from within. Not particularly a democratic process. What they managed to create here is a pretty foundational piece of work, very impressive in many ways, but not a very democratic process of creating this new system of government. That is what it is. I also want us to understand that this document is by no means perfect, okay? We got these individuals here, many of whom think highly of themselves. They're of higher class, so they're dressed fancy. They're dressed in a kind of maybe warmer type of fabric. And they're here in the middle of the summer, locked in this room, sweating their off, okay? And this is when there's no AC and there's no deodorant. A lot of them are just wanting to get the heck out of there as quickly as they can. And they're tired of coming in here every day in this hot room, arguing back and forth with people who they don't really agree with. We need to remember also there's a lot of disunity among the states. Remember, they're emphasizing states more than united at this point. We've seen that even since their colonial days, they've had all kinds of differences, some of these states. So a lot of the Constitution is just compromises for their various conflicts. I would say, though, that's part of what makes it a wonderful document. Solving conflicts, compromise, okay? And this all ties in with the idea of the social contract. Remember, the social contract suggests that people must give up certain liberties, certain rights to their government in order for the government to be able to protect bigger rights or natural rights. So, for example, I talked about how we give up our right to go barreling through school zones at 60 miles per hour to protect the bigger rights of people's safety and people's lives, right? And so we need to understand that these delegates here, whether or not they were happy about it, had to be willing to give up some rights in order for this new government to properly function in the way that they were imagining. Okay. And honestly, I think that this maybe to some extent was intentional, but I think a lot of the unintentional, like, okay, let's just get this over. Let's get a compromise. What do I have to give up so that you'll let me out of this room? That's something that I can live with and sleep with at night, is what made this Constitution function. But let's look at some of the conflicts they had and how they compromised. One major basis of conflict, of course, was the issue of central government power. How powerful would this central government be? And this was hotly debated. So you had people like Alexander Hamilton calling for a monarchy, saying, well, The best model of government we've seen in the world is our former parent, Great Britain, right? They screwed up a little bit at the end. They started doing some things that were a bit questionable, but overall, they had a pretty solid model for government. So why reinvent the wheel? Let's do what they've already done and try that. Other people said, dude, are you kidding me? We just fought a revolution in the name of liberty. We're not going back to a monarchy. But they said, you know what? We do understand where you're coming from, Hamilton, in the sense that we really do need to shift more toward order. Okay, because having too much liberty has cost us a lot of problems. We need a little more order. So therefore, we do need a somewhat stronger government, but not a monarchy. Okay, that's crossing the line. We need to maintain more liberty than that. And others said, all right, guys, I see what you're saying. We do need a little shift toward order because what we did under the articles didn't work. But still, the ideas of what we were getting out in the articles of keeping government restricted and limited, there was reasons behind that. We need to stick with that, all right? So we need a slightly more powerful government, but not much, okay? So the delegates came up with a couple of compromises to resolve this issue. They decided they would make a federal government that was a bit stronger. Well, first off, they would come up with what they referred to as a separation of powers, meaning they would break this up into multiple branches or bodies of government, all right? So they created an executive branch, which would execute the law, a legislative branch, which would make the laws, and a judicial branch, which would interpret the laws, all right? But by dividing up the different powers and responsibilities of government, it made it difficult for any one individual or any one group of individuals to abuse their powers. And to really reinforce this, they also created a series of what were referred to as checks and balances, all right? Checks and balances refers to system of checks being placed on each of these branches of government by the other, right? It's a way that they can keep an eye on one another to prevent any one body of this government here from getting out of hand, all right, from doing anything that would be considered perhaps an abuse of power by these other branches of government. So, for example, this legislative branch, which makes laws, must first propose the laws as bills to the executive branch, and the executive branch must sign off on them in order for them to become law. But if the executive receives these bills and says, guys, this is a crazy law, this does not seem like what's best for the nation, they can veto that law. But also to keep the executive from just vetoing everything and stopping anything from happening, the legislative branch also has the way of overriding the president's veto if they get enough votes, all right? And throughout this whole process, the judicial branch can be keeping an eye on them and making sure that what they're both doing is in accordance with the Constitution. So there's a series of checks and balances and a division of power for this new, stronger federal government. Another major debate, though, in terms of and the power of the federal government was how much power the federal government should have in comparison to the state governments. So some people were saying that the federal government should be much stronger than the states. Others were saying it should be only slightly stronger than the states. Others were saying the states really still need to be the main basis of power. We should barely increase the power of the federal government at all. So to find a compromise here, the framers of the Constitution created what is called a federal or federalist system of government. Remember, we saw this in the last lecture. This is a government system in which there's a division of power between various independent states and the central government. So remember, each of these states exists independently and has an independent sense of sovereignty from the central government, okay? Their power is not derived directly from the central government. They have their own state constitutions, they make their own laws, their own elected officials. However, the central government and this federalist system does have a little more influence in certain regards, okay? It's kind of the big dog in the sense that the U.S. Constitution is the supreme law of the land, meaning that none of the state constitutions or state laws can supersede the U.S. Constitution, all right? They must exist in accordance with the U.S. Constitution. And there are certain things that the states depend on the central government for. There's also things that the central government depends on the states for, though. Okay, so there's a shared sense of power. Central government has a little more power, but overall they exist independently and share power under this type of government system that was created. Another major debate was over whether state population should determine the number of representatives that states received in this new national Congress, which was the legislative branch, right? So big states like Virginia suggested, well, we have more population, therefore we should receive more representatives than smaller states since we have a bigger population. So basically what they're arguing in favor of is having the number of representatives that each state had in Congress to be based on their population. Smaller states like New Jersey, though, said, no way. We need a flat number of representatives, regardless of state size or population. All right. As a smaller state, we shouldn't matter any less than Virginia just because they're bigger and have more people. So a common ground was found here, referred to as the Great Compromise. So the Great Compromise refers to the division of this U.S. Congress into a bicameral legislature, meaning two chambers. All right. Bicameral means two chambers, two bodies, two houses of Congress. So there's the House of Representatives and the Senate. Each of these would have representation based on different things. Okay. So the Senate would have two representatives per state, regardless of what the state population was. Okay. So in the Senate, all states had two senators representing them. In the House of Representatives, representation would be based on population. So here's a compromise appeasing the bigger states and the smaller states who wanted a flat number of representatives. Again, that's called the Great Compromise. Another thing the majority of the delegates at this convention were concerned about was giving too much power to the masses. Now, they certainly wanted to restrict the central government and keep it from getting abusive and tyrannical, but they were also very fearful of the masses. If you guys haven't noticed this by this point in class, you get a lot of people together and you start shouting some dumb ideas at them. It's real easy to get a whole bunch of people real riled up and make them do dumb things. Remember when if a guy just starts raising his fist in the air and going, ooh, 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 to an angry crowd of people, next thing you know, they're all going to be raising their fists in the air going, ooh, 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 ooh. I'm a singer in a punk rock band. I can tell you all about it. That's true. So they're scared what common people might do if they're misled by a leader who's intentionally misleading them. So they feared giving too much power to the masses for that reason. And this kind of requires us to examine some realities about American government, right? People talk about American democracy, arguing that the United States has a rich history of democratic principles. And while there certainly are some democratic principles at play within our government, we need to make it clear that the U.S. is not a direct democracy, okay? So a democracy really refers to a type of government system in which there's direct political participation for every eligible voting citizen. And citizens are voting pretty much on everything. The U.S. government's asking, can I pick up this tissue to blow my nose? Citizens have to vote. Okay, now that I picked up the tissue, can I actually go through it blowing my nose? Citizens have to vote. Now, that's a bit of an exaggeration, of course. Point being, though, citizens are voting for everything, just about. In a larger nation like the United States, which was already pretty big at this point in time with just the 13 states, let alone where we're at now, this type of system doesn't work too well. Okay, it's pretty difficult to get all the people together to vote on every single thing, let alone you got to keep the common people involved. And again, they can start being swayed. So this is not the type of government we have. What the founders of the Constitution ended up creating was a republic. All right. So under a republic, there's representatives who govern on behalf of citizens. They did, however, create a democratic republic. All right. This kind of ties back to the ideas of consent of the governed and ideas of liberty, that there does need to be some voice of the common people as the governed. So here, electors elect representatives to rule on their behalf, all right, and in many cases to vote on their behalf for bigger issues as well. Key point here, we need to understand these founders of the Constitution are more interested in founding a republic. They do not want democracy. Most of them did not favor democracy because they just equated democracy with anarchy, all right? They believed that giving people too much power would lead to mayhem. Just look at things like Bacon's Rebellion, or more recently, kind of what led directly into this, Shays' Rebellion. A republic is what they're wanting. Okay, they want a level of deference between the people and those who are governing them. All right, they want people to defer their power in a sense to government, but they did want to give the people some power. So this is where there was compromises. All right, the House of Representatives, it was decided, would have its representatives directly elected by the people, giving them some power. But the Senate would have its representatives appointed by the state governments. Okay, now that's of course changed since then. Since the Progressive era in the early 1900s, we've had the 17th Amendment, which gives us direct election of senators. But early on, the Senate was appointed by state government. Okay, and again, that's part of this compromise of giving the people some power to appease them, but not giving them too much and placing some limits on it. Another way they tried to put some balance on the power of the masses is by creating the Electoral College, all right? So they allowed there to be this popular vote where people would go and elect their officials, Yet the Electoral College was there to review who people were voting for. And if they were voting for somebody who had just been raising their fist in the air saying, ooh, 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 and getting all the people to do the same, they could say, guys, this is not a competent leader. Sorry, we're going to vote a different way. All right. And it's the Electoral College's vote who would really matter in the grand scheme. Another conflict they had was over slavery, not over whether slavery should exist or not, but where it stood in the terms of representation. All right, there were some states who depended very little on slavery, at least in theory. All the states benefited economically in one way or another from slavery. But we need to understand that by the end of the revolution, some states had already, as we've seen, began implementing gradual emancipation because they viewed slavery as contradictory to the American ideas of liberty that drove the American Revolution. But some of the southern states argued that they needed slavery. Right now, I've addressed this whole argument here before when we looked at colonial slavery. And I say, in most cases, I agree that things are open to interpretation, but this is a hill that I will die on. No human being ever, under any circumstance, needs to enslave another human being. Okay, there was no need for slavery. Now, here in the South, they did create a society that became so heavily dependent on slavery that if it was taken away immediately, it would be very difficult for that Southern society to kind of maintain itself and regroup from that. But there was never a need for them to create that kind of society by enslaving other human beings in the first place. Right? So, not sure that's the best word to use there, but that's the word they were using. A lot of people in these states also claimed that African Americans were not guaranteed American liberty because they were inferior in some shape, form, or fashion. Okay. And they justified slavery in these southern states through this concept known as paternalism. Okay. Paternalism is basically a situation in which one group of individuals is subordinating another group of individuals, and they justify it by saying, oh, we're actually providing them a sense of care because they're unable of doing so for themselves. Okay, so in this case, enslavers would say, we're actually providing benefits for enslaved people because they are incapable of doing simple things for themselves that we're providing for them. So we're providing them with things like housing and food and clothing that they would be incapable of maintaining for themselves. Now, as we've seen moving forward from here, that is a load of bloop, bloop. But that was the argument being made to justify slavery in these other states. But regardless, despite making these kinds of claims, enslaved people should be enslaved. And they also, of course, as we've seen, suggested that enslaved people are legally not people, but property. Despite all that, southern states wanted to see enslaved peoples count toward their population. Okay, and the reason for this is there are fewer free people in southern states as a whole than there are in northern states as a whole, where there's less slavery. So to kind of make up for the differences in population, they're wanting to count enslaved people toward their population to get a higher number of representatives. So they're basically wanting to use enslaved people to provide themselves a sense of political power. Now, the enslaved people themselves, of course, would not receive any representation, but they are wanting them to count toward their representation. And the major argument against this was not the fact that this is very inhumane or anything like that. Major argument that other states had against this was that, hey, enslaved people are not people, they're property. So you can't count property toward being a human being to count toward your representation. That was the big pushback to this. And the compromise that was made in this regard is what's referred to as the 3/5 compromise. All right. And the 3/5 compromise basically counted 3/5 of the population of enslaved people in any given state toward their overall population. And really, if you work out the logistics of this, that also means that enslaved people were considered 3/5 of a human being. Furthermore, this would kind of encourage states that had lower free populations to continue to practice slavery and to even grow their number of enslaved people in their state, because that's going to lead to them getting more and more representation. Another compromise made in regard to slavery was what was known as the Fugitive Slave Clause. So the word slave was not actually used here. It's just called the Fugitive Clause, but it's pretty clear what they're talking about here. The word slave was actually never included in the U.S. Constitution until the 13th Amendment after the Civil War, which ended slavery. They'd use all kinds of cute terms like persons and conditions of servitude and things like that. But it's very clear that slavery is embedded in the fabric of the U.S. Constitution, all right? And the Fugitive Slave Clause is one of those places. This basically declared that all enslaved people are their enslavers' property regardless of where they were, meaning that even if they went to a state where slavery wasn't practiced anymore, that did not free them from their condition of servitude. This also further suggested that any free person who came across an enslaved person who had escaped had some kind of obligation legally to help return that enslaved person to their enslaver. All right. This would get further amplified moving along forward. All right, so there's all these compromises made, and they wrapped up this constitution, put it through a few different drafts, and finally got it together. Well, then they had to go through the process of getting this approved. All right, so they knew if they just went out to the common people and said, "Hey, guess what? We made y'all new government," they were going to get an insurrection on their hands. So they said, all right, we need to get this approved by the states. We'll go run it by the people, have them decide if they want representatives to go serve in a constitutional convention. And if they do, then those representatives will then vote on whether or not to approve this thing. Okay, so to make that very simple, what we're asking about here in terms of ratification is, do you approve of this constitution in your state? They decided that 9 of 13 states had to ratify it in order for it to pass. Another condition they placed was that New York and Virginia had to ratify it. New York because it was the capital at this time, and Virginia because it was the oldest state in the nation. Both of these states had to be on board with this thing for it to go into effect. And pretty quickly, as states were being called on to ratify the Constitution, there was a division among various factions. Okay, please understand, these are not political parties. These are factions of people concerned with one issue, which in this case is the ratification of the U.S. Constitution. So one faction was a group of individuals referred to as Federalists. These are people who supported ratification of the Constitution. Some key leaders here were people like Alexander Hamilton, who wanted a stronger government, though he really wanted to see it a lot stronger. He ended up saying, well, once the Constitution came together, he said, well, I guess it's better than anarchy. But he certainly liked that it was calling for stronger government, so he supported it. James Madison also was the chief author of this thing, so of course he's going to be in favor of it. And this is going to get a little confusing moving forward, guys, because we'll have another political party referred to as the Federalists as well, and we need to be able to distinguish this faction from the political party later down the road. Because there are members who are Federalists in terms of supporting the Constitution being ratified, but who will later join the opposite party of the Federalist Party. So James Madison, for example, is not going to join the Federalist Party. He's going to join their rivals under Thomas Jefferson. Anyway, another faction known as Anti-Federalists opposed ratification. They were trying to convince the states to not ratify the Constitution, suggesting that this was shifting far too much toward order, far too much having a strong central government. And they were fearful that this might create a type of central government that was so strong that it would become tyrannical and abuse the liberties of the people. This is really also ties into why certain states and certain individuals did not attend the Constitutional Convention. All right, this is exactly what Rhode Island was skeptical of and why they sent no delegates to the convention. Furthermore, Patrick Henry, along with George Mason, were very skeptical of this. Patrick Henry, who was quoted, of course, saying, "Give me liberty or give me death," very much a patriot during the Revolution, refused to show up at the Constitutional Convention despite being invited because he said he smelled a rat, meaning he knew something was not quite right, that they were looking at a little more than just amending the Articles of Confederation in this convention. And sure enough, they ended up creating this new constitution, which he considered to be very threatening in the way it was giving too much power to government. But to kind of ease the concerns of anti-federalists and people who they were convincing, the Federalists wrote a series of essays referred to as the Federalist Papers. So these Federalist Papers demonstrate that power of good writing, absolutely, and they led to tremendous support for the U.S. Constitution. All right, they basically took arguments that the anti-federalists were making against the Constitution or concerns that they knew a lot of people had about the Constitution and tried to level them out. All right, so they'd say, okay, I know some of you guys are scared that there's going to be an executive. Well, don't worry, he's not going to be anything like a king. He's one of 3 branches of government, and there's going to be a series of checks and balances keeping him from abusing his power. All right. And through these essays, they gained tremendous support for the Constitution. However, there was still one thing missing from this Constitution that no matter how persuasive the Federalist Papers were, kept a lot of people very skeptical. And that was a Bill of Rights, okay? This Constitution was lacking a Bill of Rights, meaning there's no guaranteed protections for the liberties of common people. And so the Federalists made a promise. They said, look, if you guys ratify this Constitution and we get it enacted, we will go ahead and add on a Bill of Rights as soon as we get it going. All right, we'll amend the Constitution to add a Bill of Rights. And they eventually managed to convince all 13 states to ratify this Constitution. Now, some took longer than others. The majority were on board with it simply with the promise of a Bill of Rights. Other states waited until there was actually a Bill of Rights added to the thing before they were willing to ratify. But overall, all 13 states did end up approving of this new constitution, and it did go into effect. All right, I want to wrap up by briefly reviewing the Bill of Rights. Again, you should have reviewed this by now for your reading video quiz, but I just want to be sure to take an opportunity to present this to you as well. So the Bill of Rights ultimately refers to the first 10 amendments of the Constitution. So one thing I argue is a true strength of the U.S. Constitution is that it is amendable and subject to change, right? The founders who were sitting there arguing over every little point in that hot, sweaty room knew that they were not going to create a perfect document, and they knew that there would be things they weren't considering that would arise further in time, and that's why they left this thing amendable as necessary. Now, there's a whole process that it has to go through in order for it to be amended so that we don't just go change it left and right over nothing, but it is amendable and subject to change as necessary. Okay. Let's look at the amendments they created here to protect the liberties of the common people. So in addition to being the first 10 amendments of the U.S. Constitution, the Bill of Rights are also the guaranteed protections for the liberties of all people in the United States. So let's take a look first at this First Amendment. There's the text. I'm not going to read it out word for word, but essentially it protects the freedom of religion, speech, press, assembly, and the freedom of people to petition the government, okay? So it allows people to have free speech, free press, to gather an assembly, and to petition the government. All right, Second Amendment, of course, is very controversial, kind of hotly debated in many ways in the present day. This guarantees the right to have a regulated militia and the right to bear arms. Now, some people will say that right to bear arms ties directly into the right to militia, so we don't all need guns as common people. Other people say, hell no, it says we have the right to bear arms and the right to militia. One doesn't necessarily have to depend on the other. And other people get caught up in this part where it says that this right shall not be infringed, which is kind of the whole purpose of this, to restrict the power the government has over common people. And people will say, well, then that means that we cannot do anything to have any laws regarding guns. Others will say, well, okay, there's other clauses in the Constitution, though, that talk about the general welfare of the nation and the federal government doing what's necessary and proper to protect that general welfare. So perhaps this is a place where we can have some leeway, some wiggle room to interpret the Constitution a little loosely and make some kinds of restrictions to this right that we have here. The Third Amendment is a pretty direct response to the American Revolution. This protects people from having to quarter troops in their private homes during times of peace or times of war. God, remember, throughout the American Revolution, there was the Quartering Act, where people were required in some cases to quarter private troops in their homes or in private businesses. This prevents that from happening here in the United States. Fourth Amendment protects people from unreasonable search and seizure. So technically you do need a warrant for this, but there's also the issue of probable cause. But if you ever feel as if you're being searched for a condition where there was not true probable cause, or that something's not quite right, you have this Fourth Amendment to turn back to. Okay, there is a protection in place saying that there must be some kind of probable cause, or there must be some kind of legal warrant for your person or for your property to be searched or seized by any level of government or law enforcement. Fifth Amendment, there's a lot going on here. This guarantees a person that they should not have to testify against themselves when accused of a crime. All right, I respectfully invoke my right granted to me by the Fifth Amendment to the United States Constitution, and I decline to answer any question on the grounds that my answers may incriminate me. All right, you can say that over and over and over in court, and that's legal. You don't have to testify against yourself. This also guarantees protection from a person being tried for the same twice for the same crime in a criminal court. Okay, that's referred to as double jeopardy. Now, we do need to understand that if you're being tried for a crime, say at the federal level, you could be tried at the federal level, and you could be tried at the state level, and you can be tried at the local municipal level as well. And from there, you can be tried at the municipal and the county level. So there are ways that you can be tried multiple times for the same crime, but not by the same court for the same crime. Okay. Furthermore, you need to keep in mind, if a person is accused of, say, kidnapping and murder, they can be tried separately for the kidnapping and for the murder, even if they occurred within the same incident. But they can't be tried for either of those multiple times by the same level of government, all right, unless they request a retrial. This also guarantees due process of law in any criminal cases, right? Meaning there's a procedure that must be followed in terms of you must be informed of what charges are brought against you. You have the right to speak to a judge. You're not just being held for an undisclosed period of time, not understanding what you're being accused of or whatever, okay? This also guarantees the protection of private property without just compensation, meaning the federal government cannot just come and take your land or take your home and say, we want to build over here, all right? And they can't just take something from you. They have to, if they want something from you, to offer you some form of compensation. So this ties into the concept of eminent domain, okay? If the federal government wants you to move, say, for example, your home because they want to do something on the land you're living on, they can put all kinds of pressure on you to do so, but they cannot force you, okay? And if they really want you to leave, they must be willing to give you some kind of compensation, financially, that is, for you to give up your property there, all right? You can't just be forced out of your home because the federal government wants you out. Sixth Amendment guarantees the right to a speedy trial by an impartial jury of one's peers in a criminal case. All right. And people whine when they get jury duty, say, oh, I don't want to go. It's boring. Get over it. Be bored for a while. That is a fundamental right and a privilege that we get to share with each other to give each other fair trials. This is a very democratic principle within this republic. That is an absolute gift that you should not take for granted. Okay. There are people sitting in jails and prisons right now because some lazy jurors decided, oh, they didn't want to do this. They wanted to get out of there as quickly as possible. So they just kind of went along with whatever a certain lawyer said. And they listened to only his side of the evidence because it was most convincing and as easiest to just go along with that and get out of there instead of actually sitting there and doing their job as a jury. So if you ever get jury duty, take that seriously. Be bored and be okay with it, okay? Because it's part of a bigger, important democratic process within our republic. This also guarantees the right to legal counsel in criminal cases. The Seventh Amendment guarantees that same right of a jury to one's peers in a civil case as well. Eighth Amendment says that there shall be no excessive bail or fines or cruel and unusual punishment. What do we mean by excessive and cruel and unusual? Okay, you'll see some bails and fines that people have to pay for certain crimes in comparison to things that other people have to pay for other crimes. And that's a pretty high number there. Things like solitary confinement, I would certainly consider to be cruel and unusual, right? You're locking somebody away from most human contact for long periods of time, making them lose their minds. Some of the techniques used to pressure people psychologically to give up certain information that law enforcement in many cases wants to hear, I would consider a lot of those tactics to be cruel and unusual punishment. But hey, who am I to say? But if I ever wind up in a situation where I felt as if those kinds of tactics being used in a certain situation were in a particular case excessive fines or cruel and unusual punishment, hey, I can get over my soapbox and I can go take this to trial because I have this constitutional amendment here that I can turn to. Right, that's the thing about these amendments. While there are ways that you may not see them practiced at play, they're there on the books, so you can use them to say, hey, this is my right and you are violating it. Okay. Ninth Amendment says that people's rights are not strictly limited by the Constitution. Okay, so there's rights that are not written here word for word. Just because the Constitution doesn't say we can do something doesn't mean we cannot do it. All right. So, for example, things like our right to have personal income, or to choose our profession, or to travel from state to state. Okay, there's nothing in the Constitution saying citizens and individuals within the nation have the right to travel from one state to another. But hell, that's kind of a given. We have that right, right? So there's certain rights in here. It's saying that just because they're not stated doesn't mean we don't have them. Right to an education, which you're all practicing right now, absolutely a right made possible by this Ninth Amendment. The 10th Amendment, this is frequently referred to as the States' Rights Amendment, and this essentially says that anything that the federal government is not allowed to do per the Constitution, if there's anything that's kind of not called for the federal government in the Constitution, that power then lies with the states, okay? And it's up to the states to make that kind of decision. All right, guys, so that is the Bill of Rights in a nutshell, the Constitution in a nutshell, and how the Constitution got enacted. If you have any questions about any of this, please ask, guys. This is very important stuff for all of you to be familiar with throughout your lives. And I want to give you an opportunity that even if you never look at the Constitution again at any point in your life, I wanted to make you look at it here at least once, as well as your Bill of Rights, to see what your fundamental rights are here in this country. Um, I am by no means an expert on the Constitution. I know a lot of the basics. I know the history around it, but I do have a good friend who is a political scientist and he works on our campus. So he'd be glad to answer any questions that I may need to pass along to him if there's anything particular you want to know about the Constitution. So what I'm saying is ask, ask, ask. If I don't have an answer, I know right where to go to get you a solid answer. Okay. Uh, anyway, I'm going to wrap this up here, guys. Y'all listen to me blabber long enough. This is it for now. Over and out.